Castrino, manager of the nonprofit Plastic Pollution Coalition and author of the book Thicker Than Water. Erica, could you please speak a little about the Plastic Pollution Coalition and what it does?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. At Plastic Pollution Coalition, we educate, connect, and advocate for a world free of plastic pollution. And this is done mainly through our work in communications, which I have the great pleasure of managing. And so we try to connect with people wherever they are in their journey, understanding the plastic crisis, from social media platforms to more popular media like online news publications and TV, as well as film. So all across the board, trying to reach people where they are. And I've put together a little slideshow, if you don't mind me sharing it. I know that I have 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm going to just cue that up if that's all right with all. I might need permissions to do so, though. Not sure if someone has screen sharing.
Yeah, I think we have to make you a co-host. Star, are you able to do that?
Yes, let me check here.
I just made her a co-host.
Yeah, I was like, Linda, I think you have to. Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, I will cue this right up. All right, so I'm going to start from the top here. As many of you may know, we are now living in a totally new geological era, and this is not necessarily for the best, but our planet and our bodies are polluted by plastic. And this is something that's been in the works since the 1940s, when plastics were first produced for mass consumption following World War II. So plastics are made out of fossil fuels, and I'll get more into that in a bit, but this is kind of where we're coming from. So from a historical perspective, plastics have been a huge part of our economy and part of our world, in the sense of they make just about everything. If you look around you, I almost guarantee you that you will see plastic. I've even tried to build my house free of plastic and have not succeeded because it is just that difficult to do so. But these are some of the things that we're told about plastic from fossil fuel and plastics companies. So examples being plastics are vital for a low carbon economy. They're lightweight, shipping costs and shipping requirements with fuels, fossil fuels in a time where we know, the climate crisis is upon us. We need to do something about this, and saying that plastics are lightweight seems to be one of the strategies that fossil fuel organizations are using. So also, plastic makes life possible. Without plastics, many companies have said at this point that, we wouldn't have the medical breakthroughs that we've had, or making people's lives as convenient. And the last 2 points, they're connected, but the idea that plastics are circular. So the word circular economy has risen, or circular lifestyles, as kind of an antidote to the throwaway lifestyles that we've been developing over the past 100 years or so. Really, people have always wasted things from the beginning of time, right? But these things at first were nature-based things. So maybe, the rinds of fruit or vegetable waste, etc., bones from animals that people hunted. But now we live in a material age, so much is wasted when our materials are made just for one use. So the idea that plastics are circular because they are recyclable is something that these companies want us to think. And unfortunately, the truth is very far from the reality. So we get a lot of these terms thrown around, to make plastic seem greener than it is. The reality is that only 9% of plastics have been recycled over time since the 1940s, and this number is actually a lot less in certain places. So in the US, for example, where I'm from, it's thought that only about 5% of plastics are recycled. And why is that? Well, being made of fossil fuels, in addition to many toxic chemical additives, plastics are not as green or healthy as companies have kind of tried to portray them as being. And despite them being in virtually all aspects of our lives, again, from what our houses are made out of, from most of our clothing is made out of plastic, It's holding most of our foods and it's been used in medicine. So these are some of the terms that I call or that I identify as greenwashing. And these are terms that corporations use to, again, make these products seem either healthier or cleaner for the environment than they really are. So what is the actual reality? True cost of plastics is that they are deadly up and down the pipe from the moment they're extracted as fossil fuels, which requires tons of energy and releases toxic pollution into the environment in the form of air pollution and also tailings that are toxic. I'm sorry, someone might have to mute themselves. To the point where we're transporting plastics and their ingredients on trains. The raw ingredients, fossil fuels, are also transported in pipelines, which we know are vulnerable to leaks, and then the refineries where plastics and petrochemicals are created. And then finally, the end of the pipe where we have stuff all over that is plastic, again, including covering our food. And then we have a big mountain of waste that is the result of this. So when we're done using plastics, this is the main problem with plastics, is that it never goes away, it only goes somewhere else. So plastics are thrown away. We might throw them in our recycling bin, even though we know that most plastics are not recycled. And this is all good and well, except that this stuff is ending up mainly in landfills in the environment. So this is a landfill near where I grew up. And the community closest to this landfill, unfortunately, like most communities affected by plastics and petrochemical pollution, is Black and low income. There's also a large and growing population of people of color in this community from other backgrounds and also Indigenous folks. So these long underserved groups are also exposed to the worst pollution in my country, but also in many other countries around the world. So this is the result largely of years and years of systemic racism. Another aspect of this is waste colonialism, where wealthier countries like the US, but many in Europe as well, are shipping their waste overseas to developing nations, especially in the global South, where there's no infrastructure to deal with plastics. And this stuff is getting dumped and burned in people's backyards, again, causing health effects in the least served communities. So the burning of plastics occurs all over, and this is releasing toxic chemicals into our environment, as well as plastic particles that shed off of all plastic stuff. But this process is sped up when plastic is burned or exposed to water. And so plastic fuels the climate crisis because it's constantly all throughout these processes that I've just showed you, from the beginning of the pipe to the end of the pipe. Plastic is emitting greenhouse gases in addition to toxic chemicals. And these greenhouse gases are speeding up the rate at which our climate is warming, and it's causing all different issues, as I'm sure many of you are very well aware, in regard to floods and droughts and unstable weather patterns that are really putting human life and then also other life at risk of extinction. So what is needed now to kind of counteract all of the misinformation and issues that come along with plastics, and also the fact that we've been sold plastics as a material? So we never really needed plastics per se, in the sense that maybe different materials would have been in the place of plastic should plastics not have been invented and rolled out for mass consumption. Again, this is in the 1940s, so less than 100 years ago. So how do we solve this problem that is so clearly grown out of control and out of proportion? So I think a really big thing that we do at Plastic Pollution Coalition that excites me is engaging people in terms of a values shift kind of conversation. So we can think about all the plastic stuff in our lives and then think about, what do we really need? So you'll see a lot of familiar items. This was just from 1 hour walking around a local park that I'm in, and you see all the stuff that we use and it's so familiar, but yet when it's put in nature, it can seem so unnatural, which is a good thing. It's good that our eyes want to recognize that, and our hearts also see all this plastic building up is not a good thing. And then we can also know that the natural world that we need to survive is a limited thing. It is a place where once it is polluted to the point where we can't use it anymore, we cannot use it anymore. And there's only so much damage that Earth can sustain without throwing things out of balance. And again, people are at great risk. There are other animals also at great risk should the climate crisis and plastic crisis escalate. But ultimately, the Earth should be okay in the sense that one day Earth will recover. But as far as I know, most of us want to be here for a long time, and it can be really hard and heartbreaking to watch this transformation. So I also want to make space for that. In this mission, that we can kind of push forward and recognize that we have this one thing in common, the Earth, right? So if we have a culture shift to recognize that, what do we need to do to push that forward? So this is just a short section on how do we move from here. So engaging in plastic free and also on a larger scale, petrochemical free principles, because again, most plastics being made from gas, oil, and also coal means that the energy sources that have largely driven the climate crisis are also linked to toxic pollution with plastics and also other chemicals, which for the sake of time, I will not get into, but happy to have more conversations about that as well. But here are some of the key plastic-free principles that everyone on every scale can engage with, from, us as individuals, for me, simply choosing to drink out of, stainless steel or ceramic or glass rather than plastic, to businesses that implement reuse and refill solutions, institutions that enable us to, go to a place to share and exchange our stuff instead of needing to buy more of it. And then also I want to mention like design and businesses that create items that can be endlessly repaired rather than needing to be thrown away and bought again. And then lastly, of course, refusing single use. So here are some individual actions that we can take, right? Just engaging in ways without a need for single use stuff. This is a more kind of business or systems level when we can actually interact with a built environment or systems like stores and institutions that offer us the ability to not buy single use, because so much of our world is compulsory single use. Often when I go out to eat, even if I'm at a sit down restaurant, someone will put a straw in my drink before I could say, please don't give me a straw. I'm sure that happens to many of you as well. And it's just, excuse me, a need to shift our expectations and our way of approaching this issue. So cleanups and education, many of you might have participated in a cleanup, beach cleanup. I just want to say that this is not the solution to the plastic problem. Again, we need to engage with these principles that stop waste before it starts. So stop it at the source. And if we do choose single-use materials, we really need to choose materials that are non-toxic and renewable and do not contribute to the generation of greenhouse gases in a significant way. In fact, I'll say that you can see bamboo and algae. So these are two plants, and they actually can absorb CO2 when planted or farmed in the right way. We also need to be able to, on a global scale, agree that these certain tenets of life matter and that we can curb the business practices that are really toxic. So calling out greenwashing where it exists, also calling out the realities of the plastic and climate crises. So the UN Plastics Treaty is actually going to be negotiated in its second session from May 29th to June 2nd. So this is upcoming. And what's really hoped for at this time is that we can agree on certain key points to push forward in the development of this global treaty. And this could be, as long as industry and influence and interests are not pandered to, and instead that people and the planet are prioritized over profits, is that we could have a pathway to really revolutionizing the way that we live on this planet and going from a single-use world to a circular world, the world that my organization really would love to see. So another key aspect is the justice aspect. As I mentioned, there's a lot of unfairness, and this unfairness is deadly to fence line and frontline communities. So we must end our reliance on fossil fuels as well as the resulting plastics and other chemicals. in order to achieve racial justice. And so as we engage with these solutions, we have to be really careful to watch out for greenwashing and false solutions. Again, we need to turn off the tap of plastic and implement these better ways forward. And everyone wants to make money, it seems, from solutions. And I think that a big shift will really come when we recognize we need to put the common good, people on the planet before profits, always. And a lot of these insights I've gained from not only working at Plastic Pollution Coalition, but by going to the front lines of the crisis while writing my book, Thicker Than Water. So I just add this slide in to to encourage you as an individual to really dive below the surface when you're interacting with facts and also with our world, because there's so much information out there. But to really understand the truth, as I did, I'm someone who grew up in the 1990s. This was a time where much of this information about plastics was not known. And in fact, plastic production was seriously ramping up to the point where now, we live in a pretty much completely plastified world. And so when I was young, I didn't think this stuff about plastic was the reality. And yet you are all young people and you get to know the truth, which is really an exciting thing. Because imagine how much change you can make, starting from this point, which is really cool. So from there, if you want to learn more, here's my book. And then also, of course, plasticpollutioncoalition.org. It's a great website for learning more about this issue, from the facts to the solutions, and then also connecting with our huge coalition. So there might be an organization near you that you'd like to volunteer with or join. And you can find out more on our website. So I think that clocks in at my time, but I just want to say thank you. And it was such a pleasure to be here today. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, awesome. That was really great. Thank you so much for giving us that background. We have a couple of questions prepared that we would like to ask you more about greenwashing. And I think you kind of covered this already, but the first one is, what is greenwashing and how does it relate to climate change?
Sure. So again, this term greenwashing, it's basically, and I love the imagery that was out there that I found from my slide, but basically you are painting something that is not sustainable, not eco-friendly as something that is. And so this is done often to delay and distract from real solutions, because those real solutions would not make the company selling, single-use products profitable. And to point out also that these single-use products, they are almost the perfect consumer item because you have to buy them again and again. And then there's an industry because the waste industry then collects them. So then that industry makes money. And so we would really have to radically reshift the way that we prioritize our economy to avoid the need for greenwashing, because this greenwashing is basically a sales tactic, right? So that's how I describe it.
We have another
What are some
question.
ways to,
Oh.
what are some ways
Oh.
to spot green? Yeah, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so what are some ways to spot greenwashing with respect to sustainable products?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different products out there that can be really tricky to identify. I put some of those terms in my presentation. Again, I'll just cue that up so I can read them to you. But we're looking for like packaging that might be, say you have a plastic product and it's simply wrapped in like green or brown. Well, as humans, this is something that's the result of like psychological studies and marketing studies, but we tend to associate things that are in more natural colors with natural products, right? So we'll think this is maybe good for the environment because it's just wrapped in brown or green, and instead of something that's in maybe like bright colors that seems man-made or synthetic. But some of the terms that you might see are made of recycled ocean plastic, which this is one that has been used to make a lot of like clothing and apparel as well. And I would say avoid those clothing and apparel because we know now that plastics are not good for us chemically. And then also knowing that cleaning up ocean plastics or plastics found from beach cleanups this is plastic that might be contaminated. It also might be, marketed in a way that seems green and clean, but the reality is that all plastic stuff all around us, including our clothing, for a large part, is shedding plastic particles right back into the environment. So these particles are found in air, water, the oceans, and in our food supply. And now ultimately we know in our bodies. So the more we, reuse plastics, especially for these uses where plastic might again be rapidly used and discarded. So fast fashion being one of those things. We want to avoid that because this is stuff that's just going to go right back into our environment and our bodies, whereas maybe other materials are more sturdy and more benign. So that's how I'll put it that way.
How is greenwashing harmful?
So it's harmful because, again, this is going to delay and distract us from really making the change that we need. A lot of these plastic products and other single-use products are kind of quick fixes or might seem like, super helpful in the moment, but in reality, we have to consider the whole full cost of, say, like a plastic bottle. And so it's not only the cost of it going into potentially a landfill, but it's also the extraction of the fossil fuel ingredients, the additives that have been put into it, the microplastics shed throughout the process, and so many other things too. So, right, so we have to think about like, where can we really see through plastics in the sense of like, why is this company selling this product? So yeah, we need to be able to see the full cost.
So for our next question, how do companies use greenwashing to benefit them?
So greenwashing is such a good marketing tactic in the sense that if we might, think something is greener than it is, like right now, there's surveys that have showed us that public awareness of environmental issues is growing, and that's really good thing, but it also opens up the avenue that companies tap into that desire to, do better for the environment, but they might not actually be doing so. So again, if you're selling a plastic product, and as we know, there's huge cost to this and other products as well, right, that cause pollution and injustice. But companies make a lot of money from this because people will want to buy things that make them feel good. And so there's lots of studies showing that, while this awareness has risen, unless we really do the key action of shutting off the plastic tap, we're going to still have this problem. So that's one way that these not so great businesses stay in business.
So, how can we really take action and do something meaningful without focusing on something irrelevant? Like sometimes you'll hear people say that the little actions aren't really worth it, or that encouraging them is sort of a way of greenwashing in itself, saying that it will really help. So how can we take action and help? And do those really little actions matter?
That's a great question. And I never want people to feel discouraged because I do believe that the little actions matter, and it's all a snowball effect. So it starts with you, and everything that you can do to embrace the cultural shift that we need, and then also pass it forward to others, is super helpful and beneficial, no matter how small your circle is, right? So if it's your friends and family, and then maybe on a bigger scale, your community, your school, for example, and then, getting out there, for example, like I'm in the media, right? So I try to write stories so that they reach a large audience, but it really starts with you. Like if I didn't fully try to do things in my life, and again, I'm not perfect, but if I didn't try to eliminate my use of plastics, I started with years and years ago, bringing reusable bags to the grocery store, right? Like a super easy thing to do. Getting a reusable water bottle, bringing cutlery with me wherever I went, so I didn't need plastic stuff, like just little things like that. They do help. And I think that seeing the larger cultural shift around me really challenges me to be even more strict with myself, I guess, right? Like, so again, I tried to build a house with no plastic. So it builds and builds and builds. And then in my own individual life, I engage on a wider systems level, pushing for the changes we need. So being aware of policies in your area, for example, like bans on plastic stuff, that's really helpful. And then also we need the bigger scale action of the Global Plastics Treaty really holding polluters accountable. Being engaged with your local policymakers can also help lead to better protections for your community when it comes to different types of pollution, not just plastic itself, but also all that's related to plastic. So yeah, these are lots of ideas, but there is so much you can do to help.
There has recently been information coming out about how recycling is efficient or unrealistic. Is recycling an example of greenwashing, or is it beneficial?
This is such a complicated question, but I will answer it the best I can. So something important to note, and I like to give this cultural context because it gives you an idea of how we got to where we are. So if you really look way back, the editor of Modern Packaging magazine said decades and decades ago, the future of plastics is in the trash can. So plastics were never initially designed to be recycled, and starting really in the 60s and 70s, recycling of plastics arose as an antidote to all the plastic being found in the environment. And then at that time, the industries making plastics and petrochemicals, they shifted their narrative and they said, well, pollution is a problem, because really quickly pollution became a problem, right? So if plastics are blowing everywhere, or they're ending up in our environment because they, fly out of your trash can, they're littered, whatever. So they created this narrative that plastics were a problem because the public was not doing the right thing. So we were littering, we were not recycling. And where the reality was that this was never the idea about plastics, like they were only supposed to be thrown away. So that's a really interesting way to approach this, because then you kind of can see the greenwashing in plastics recycling. And we do need to find something to do with all the plastic all around us, but I don't think anyone has a good idea. This is not to say that other materials don't have certain costs to them, right? So we can recycle metals, we can recycle paper and glass, and they are recycled at much higher rates than plastic, right? They're also a lot less toxic. They require, in certain situations, can require less energy and less water to process. But the big but is they still have costs to people on the planet. And I think the biggest question is, how can we make systems of material stuff that are more endlessly reusable rather than needing to be reprocessed? And if we look at the waste hierarchy, so this is a proposed way of looking at how we deal with our material world. So stuff that can be endlessly reused is at the very top. So if you have, like, say, a water bottle, can you use it forever? It doesn't need to be returned anywhere. You can just wash it at your house, you know what I mean? But then if you have to send stuff back to a company or get things refilled, like that's the next layer and layer down. And then we get into, then mechanical recycling of our stuff, and then landfilling our stuff, incinerating our stuff. Like, these are things that we want to avoid, but they are on that hierarchy because we need to do something with all this stuff, right? So yeah, this has gone into a longer discussion, and I don't know how much time we have for this, but I just want to say that we can look at plastic recycling as a form of greenwashing based on the historical context. Yes.
So what should we really do to help fight greenwashing as well as plastic pollution and climate change?
We need not only the individual shift, but the systems shift. So calling for the world around us to start operating differently. And this really starts with calling out these corporations that have long polluted our planet, and stopping them from doing more of the damage. And these system shifts that we need, looking at these principles, these values that we should kind of all share in common if we want to make this change. They're very simple things. So reusing, refilling, repairing, sharing, and refusing single use. These are things that we can just keep putting out there into the world, and then also implementing them in our own communities. So, like, again, starting with your family, your friends, your school, and then branching out. So people are engaged in solutions, and I think that's a really hopeful thing, because we do have a track record for change. It's just scaling it up and getting it out there.
Now we would like to open up the floor for all of you. Do you have any questions about greenwashing, climate change, or plastic pollution?
And then Mara, do you want to start at the top? Because there's a bunch of questions in the chat.
Oh yeah, you want me to read them?
Sure,
Yeah.
I got it. I see it. There are a lot of good questions. So this is
Okay.
exciting. I like the participation. So the first one is, what do you imagine will happen to the plastics around the world that are still being created today if we are not refusing to burn it?
That's a great
Using or
question.
burning it, sorry.
Yeah, great question. Again, I don't think there's a good answer for this. So like if we think about other materials, like I like to think on like a bigger comparative basis to say, like, are we going to treat plastic like the toxic product it is, right? So because so much plastic is around us, it's becoming hazardous, because if it was maybe a smaller amount, it wouldn't be so detrimental. We don't know that for sure. Plastics has only been around for less than 100 years. So long-term studies on this material do not exist. Like even just human familiarity with plastics is a relatively recent thing. So if we're not reusing it or burning it, we might think about collecting it and putting it into, say, like a spent nuclear fuel repository. You know what I mean? Like there could be, if we treat it like that. But the question is, I'm not saying that we should do this or that, but I think that's the question that remains, because burning it is very hazardous. It also is contributing to climate change. Reusing it is toxifying our world and releasing all these plastic particles. So we do not have a great answer right now, but I think that's the $1 million question.
Okay, so next up is there any effective way to stop governments and companies from endorsing, using, or creating plastics that we as virtually powerless individuals can do right now?
Oh, well, whenever powerless, but it is a huge kind of David and Goliath story. And I think, like, at least in my book, I tried to highlight positive change too, because it can seem so overwhelming, but we do have to start somewhere. And I like to shed light on the story of Sharon Levine. She's an activist in St. James, Louisiana. And this is a huge petrochemical and plastics production area in the South in the US. So she managed to ward off a company called Formosa Plastics from building a huge facility in her community, which was already home to 12 other polluting industrial facilities. And she did this through a combination of community advocacy, political action, legal action, and just trying to implement real solutions in her community. And I've found this to be the case in other communities, including those at the end of the plastics pipe. So near landfills, I've been working with a community that's implementing lots of zero waste practices, despite living in the shadow of a landfill on Long Island. They have initiated waste audits. So they go through their community's trash and try and teach people how do we use less single-use stuff and less plastics. They created a community garden with a composting facility, and this is all, within a small community. So we can start at this level and keep moving up. But yeah, we need to have this global plastics treaty, I think, is the greatest possibility we have, but it's kind of hanging in a balance, because if the leading nations, push us towards, oh, we're going to keep doing business as usual with the plastics industry, listen to the plastic industry and believe in their greenwashing, then we will not get the treaty that we need to hold them accountable and shut it down. So it's a very tenuous moment. And I do have try and find it. I'm not very great at computer multitasking, but I'm going to try and do this. Finding a petition. So right now, my organization, Plastic Pollution Coalition, we're telling world leaders to take a stronger stance, and I'll put in the chat, on the Global Plastics Treaty. So this is a petition you can sign that will be delivered ahead of the treaty in the coming weeks. So this is an important action that you can take. And yeah, we have to keep spreading the truth, because that's also making these companies less powerful. I think so much more is known now than even 10 years ago. So it's really an amazing thing.
Okay, thank you. what about the health impacts that are inherent in plastics, inhalation, ingestion, or touch, and the endocrine disputing chemicals? These are never mentioned. Is that also greenwashing, promoting something as safe and clean when it is not?
Yeah, I mean, this is a key part of the story, and I didn't dive too far into it today, but I could also go down that avenue of talking about the health impacts. But plastics are not, again, this could be considered greenwashing in the sense that the corporations never fully disclosed it. I like to compare it to the tobacco industry. For example, we were told that cigarettes, not we, because we're younger, but maybe our parents and grandparents were told that, cigarettes, even doctors were recommending them. They're part of a healthy lifestyle. Soldiers who were fighting in wars got cigarettes in their food rations, along with their bread and water and whatever. And it's been a normalized part of our lives. And yet the health impacts are serious. So we're just finding out now, in the sense that plastic companies have long held these ingredients or like the composition of their plastic products as trade secrets. So there's really tens of thousands of chemicals that could be in any piece of plastic. And these chemicals are things that, are hazardous to us as humans and as living beings. These are things like bisphenols, phthalates, PFAS. There's heavy metals in a lot of plastics. I could go on and on, but I think the bottom line is that, yes, they are toxic, and when we can avoid them, it is best to do so. But I also try to take an approach where, like, we can't, as people right now, necessarily eliminate all the plastics in our lives. Some people don't have availability to do that. They don't have the economic availability to do that. So I just encourage us to avoid them whenever you can. For example, like our cell phones are large, they have so many pieces of plastic and other chemicals that are used in them, like like fire resistant chemicals and anti-static things. And like, we don't really realize it, but a lot of the stuff in our lives is hazardous to us. So just really going back to the simpler options. Again, like wood and certain types of metals are safer, ceramics. And we can also try to buy stuff that's not in packaging. So just some quick tips.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. How can we actually stop plastics from being created at the source?
Yeah, another great question, but it definitely goes, I think, hand in hand with regulation. So holding companies accountable. A lot of these companies or I'll call them companies, maybe sound smaller, but industries that create plastics. So think of like those big facilities you saw in those images I shared. Like, these are big operations. Some plastics and petrochemical facilities are like several acres large. Like, this is like a big operation. And so we need legislation to hold these polluters accountable and also prevent them from creating more plastic. So disincentivizing plastic production, because currently a lot of governments, they subsidize or give tax breaks or credits to companies that are starting up and working in the fossil fuel plastics areas. And instead of doing that, maybe we can incentivize people working on algae farming or non-toxic plant-based alternatives like mushroom mycelium, for example. And so making these other options much more accessible and palatable to be economically viable instead of, always propping up fossil fuels. And again, like, this is a limited planet with limited resources, and fossil fuels are actually set to, we're set to run out of them by 2060. So this is, not that too far down the road. So we need to do something clearly, but making more plastics is definitely not the best idea.
Okay. How can we educate people about plastic pollution?
There's lots of ways. Share what you've learned today, maybe, is one place to start. But I'll also share our facts page on the Plastic Pollution Coalition website, because my colleagues and I have worked on this page, and we really wanted to show the full endless life cycle of plastics. Again, they're never going away. So what does plastic impact and what are the costs? And then also if you want to share more about solutions, here's a solutions page breaking down the various levels of solutions that you can engage in. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, and this question is from Alicia, who's trying to build up a community of change in her local area. And so her question is, how can I convince my friends to work with me and reduce plastic pollution? Because I think that if they pick up plastic, people will laugh at them.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. That is the misconception, but it actually is unfortunately something that I have encountered in certain parts of the world. And I think in my own community too, there's like a hesitance to be seen as like the person picking up the trash. And this can go back into like, you know, our perceptions of one another. But I think making it cool to clean up plastic, like this was a big push that I saw when I visited Thailand, and like people, young people especially, were pushing forward this change, because when you come together in a group and you're doing something together, it can often be more inviting and also less likely to be judged by other people. And it's a shame that people do judge those who clean up trash. But I think that, yeah, again, coming together as a group is a good idea or a good step in the right direction. And then just having conversations with those people who don't understand why you're doing it, and really, you know, saying, well, listen, this is our community and we deserve to live in a cleaner, better place, you know. I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, thank you. Do you think plastic eating organisms and bugs can be the answer to the plastic pollution? How can we help make this possible soon?
Very interesting question. So this has been a lot in the media lately of like plastic eating bugs and fungi and bacterias, and like some of these organisms are evolving in nature, but not at the scale that we would need necessarily to like treat an entire landfill. Also, the question is like, if they escaped everywhere, you know, like would the gas lines in my car get eaten through, or like the pipes in your house, or all of our clothes, like what would happen? The world might fall apart as we know it. But in the future, maybe there is a way that we can engage with living organisms. Like, for example, there's many mushroom species that can remediate land after spills of toxic chemicals. And so maybe something similar can be done with plastics, but we have to be, I think, cautious with the trust that we put in these organisms, because again, we are kind of saying, oh, distraction, let's focus on like the end of the pipe instead of like, we have to turn off the tap now. How do we do that? How do we convince these gigantic multi-billion dollar corporations that are benefiting from destruction of the planet and killing people essentially? How do we stop them first? And then we can think about the cleanup, because we already are living in this plastic mess, right? So what's a few more years of that, but stopping it from getting bigger is super important.
I do think that is an interesting solution. It would be cool to see that come through. Can we get a list of places we can go to get things that are not sold in plastic containers? Is there a list of places, and can our teams help make this list?
That would be awesome if you worked on a list. I would say that like also on our website, we do have guides, and our business members of our Plastic Pollution Coalition are working to create those solutions. A lot of the solutions are really simple. And like, I've spoken to a lot of people who said like, it's just a matter of talking to your grandparents or great grandparents about what did they do when they were kids, because they did not have plastic on the scale that we had. Even my mother remembers, she's in her mid to late 60s, and she remembers like a time before plastic, like just when she was a kid was when it was being rolled out in mass production. But you know, they still had someone who came to their house to drop off milk or soda in glass bottles, like, and they would return those bottles, and then that would be returned to right to their doorstep. And so some of these like old school actions, you know, we might have to go back to those times. I'm also putting the coalition tab. So it's not necessarily always about buying stuff either. Like something simple that I've done as a solution in my house was, every time I buy a glass jar at the grocery store, whether it's holding like peanut butter or jam or something, I take that jar and I save it. So if I need to store my leftover food, like it's not going in plastic. And that was like pretty much a free thing that I can do at my own house. And yeah, lots of other ways too, just thinking outside the box, like learning how to repair stuff is a really great way to prevent needing more stuff. And so like think about it from like this wide-ranging perspective, I think.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, but we're gonna have to wrap it up soon. What are the biggest companies that create plastics, and can we boycott them?
So I don't want to like go into the weeds here because there's so many of them, but if you Google like, you know, highest profit oil and gas companies, petrochemical companies, you'll find many and many of them. Boycotting them is going to be really hard in the sense that, you know, you have to think about where does your electricity for your house come from? Do you drive a vehicle with oil or gas in it? Then also like tracking down who made the plastic stuff that maybe like you're wearing your clothing or your plastic in your grocery store. Like it's not always possible to connect the dots there, right? So I would say, you know, calling out these companies like by researching them and figuring out where they're operating and how they're doing business, looking at their facility track records. There's the toxic release inventory map by the EPA if you're in the United States. That's one way to kind of keep an eye on their practices, but boycotting them is much harder when you think about it's not easy to track them down. So I think, again, start at the source and go from there.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. So thank you everyone so much for joining and participating. There were some really great questions, and so I'm glad that we got to them. We hope you learned something new today. If you want to help take action for issues like greenwashing and the Sustainable Development Goals, please consider joining the Global Collab's SDG Hubs. This webinar was put together and run by the Climate Hub, and I would like to thank my Hub members, Maura, Sean, Sid, and Sibel, for helping put this together. As a Climate Hub, we're a virtual group of teens, and we're working to fight climate change, so it's fun when we can help bring people together and share about issues like greenwashing. I'd also like to thank the people from the collab who helped put this together, Linda and Star. And also let's all give a big thank you to Erica for sharing so much with us today. I learned so much. And so I'd really like to thank you for sharing all of this and helping us out. So thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure.
But before we go, I was hoping we could take a screenshot of the meeting. So if everyone wants to share their camera, so if they're comfortable with it, so we can take a screenshot real quick.